Welcome back, Trinidad and Tobago. Now, there was an article on the Telegraph newspaper and also on Forbes magazine. They're looking at female leadership at the time of this pandemic. Why do female leaders seem so good at tackling the coronavirus pandemic? Now, women make up less than 7% of world leaders, so it kind of gives you an idea of the disproportion that we're looking at. From Taiwan to Germany to New Zealand to Iceland, the responses of countries with women at their helm have generally been seen as, get this, most effective and keeping deaths down and spreading the infection and keeping it all under control. And guess what? Data seems to back it up. So at the time when there are different kind of leaders needed, because I don't think anyone or any leadership model or simulation could prepare you for dealing with a pandemic, women leaders, female leaders, seem to be slaying at all of their goals. And Dr. Gabrielle Hosein, she is the head of the Gender Institute at the University of the West Indies, also speaking about female leaders and also slaying their goals always. Dr. Hosein joins us this morning. Good morning, Dr. Hosein. How are you?
Good morning, Hema, and good morning to your viewers.
I do want to thank you. And generally, I want to congratulate you and other female leaders for continuing the work that you're doing. I know at this time we're talking about leadership, but I do want to ask before we get into the conversation about domestic violence and what we're seeing now, because I know statistically we're seeing it as a global phenomenon. We're looking at the fact that women are more at risk now of intimate partner violence is trapping women with their abusers, they're becoming victims in a prison at their homes. Are we doing enough to address this locally?
We've never done enough to address gender-based violence in the Caribbean, nor in Trinidad and Tobago. Indeed, the main state machinery for addressing gender-based violence, which is the Gender and Child Affairs in the Office of the Prime Minister, was once a ministry, but has never been adequately resourced and staffed to do the work that it could do, either at a policy level or at a coordination level. In this crisis, it's not just that women are trapped at home with their abusers. It is that families are under extreme pressure and stress, not just from being together all the time, not being able to go out, but we've seen, hunger in the tens of thousands is a risk. When 92,000 people have sought to access social assistance, then we know that we're talking about 100,000 households that are in dire conditions of economic insecurity. And so, people are contemplating losing their jobs, not getting back their jobs. How are they going to pay their rent? So we have to understand always that this is not just about men being perpetrators and domestic violence being primarily enacted by men, but this is about families being under pressure in ways that create conflict and not having ways to deal with that such that it creates the trigger for greater violence. And I think what's happening with men in the economy is extremely emasculating and creates the conditions for men to secure their manhood through violence, if not through other means. And so as a Caribbean, we continue to call for greater inclusion of gender-based violence in all recovery efforts, including understanding how our approach in the economy, that is what we choose to focus on in economic recovery, will differently affect men and women. And finally, there are legislative amendments that are being advocated for. We continue to work with the police and ask for such things as perpetrators being removed from the home. We ask for the magistracy to be able to deal with domestic violence cases without the excess number of adjournments, the absence of magistrates, and the fact that only 1/3 of women in the end have their protection orders actually granted. So there are structural and systemic issues pre-COVID that we want to just tell the government to stay the course on, whether it's legislative, judicial, policing, or in terms of us recognizing that our economic policies and our social development policies can play a role in also mitigating the conditions for gender-based violence.
Let me ask you this. You talk about the pre-existing conditions. You also mentioned the economic recovery, which is a hot topic right now while we look at to open, how do we open in this phase reopening. I know that you were very vocal about the committee that was appointed. Did that committee reach out to you or others like yourself in the sphere of gender equality in our country when we look at this road to economic recovery, understanding the role that gender plays and what we have to address?
I don't know who the committee has reached out to. They did not reach out to the Institute for Gender and Development Studies. However, we are attempting to prepare a kind of case study that looks at the gendered nature of the economy so that whatever the committee decides, you know, we have a basis for saying, have you taken into account women's wage burden of care and what that'll mean in this coming context? Have you taken into account women's higher levels of unemployment? Have you taken into account where jobs have closed in the economy and how they will differently affect women and men? So we're working on that now. I still say though, I mean, I saw a Newsday headline once that said that qualifications matter, not gender, but in a society where women have been securing tertiary level qualifications 60 to 40, you know, in relation to men, it in fact says that qualifications are not the things that matter, because women in fact have more qualifications than men in our society at a tertiary level. So we have issues of gender equality that must be put on the table, whether or not they seem to be relevant, because they meet our international obligations, because they are morally right to do, and because we've seen that they can make a difference in terms of the issues that are taken into account. However, you know, it's a male-dominated decision-making, overwhelmingly, and I nonetheless encourage the population from all sectors addressing all issues of injustice to submit your perspectives and to lobby and advocate for them to be taken into account.
Well, I do hope that the society does heed this call, because we do need to understand that this economic reality cannot be achieved without factoring gender and gender equalities and the issues that exist and pre-exist in our community. But speaking about female leadership, you know, I did call you and we reached out to you to speak on a lighter note, not a lighter note, but a more serious note internationally. Women leaders seem to be, according to several studies, they seem to be leading the countries that are doing quite well in handling this pandemic. Why is that? From, you know, you obviously have studied women leadership. We've had that. I saw even Mia Motley. She was chosen to be interviewed by Christiane Amanpour when asked about what is she tout about female leadership at this time. You know, why are women leaders distinguishing themselves at this time?
So as you said in your opening, only 7% of heads of state around the world are women, and the populations they govern are just as small. So I think we want to credit women's work and leadership where it's due, but I think we want to remain open to the fact that, you know, it's hard to draw data from such a small sample. That's the first thing. The second thing is we want to keep in mind that women's leadership does not only occur at the level of heads of state. So, for example, Mayor London Breed of California, who's the first Black woman to be a mayor of California, closed the borders, closed her, you know, developed a COVID response very, very early on in relation to other US states, and certainly in relation to the federal government. So I want us to think about the leadership that's not only happening at the top, but the women's leadership that's happening at the regional corporation level, and the women's leadership that is happening across different sectors, whether business, nursing, teaching, and all of these other areas. So I want to credit women's leadership in all the spaces where it's often invisible, but may in fact be making a difference. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we have to be careful. It's a fine line to rely on very gendered stereotypes and tropes of women as more caring leaders, as softer leaders, kinder leaders, leaders who listen more, and so on. We want to be careful about that, because we don't want to stereotype women into sort of biologically or naturally having those qualities, though we understand that overwhelmingly all women in the world are socialized to in fact have those qualities in ways that boys are not yet socialized enough. At the same time, we want to not fall for the idea that women are not decisive leaders, that women fall for the stereotype that women don't take risks. In fact, the data, all the data globally, and we can say this across the corporate sector as well as in political leadership, that women are just as decisive as men, women take risks, and that women are good leaders in the ways that we typically understand masculine qualities of being assertive, decisive, in tough times, they can make hard decisions, all of those kinds of stereotypes that are associated with masculine leadership. We want to keep in mind that the data suggests women do those just as well.
Now,
I want to take us to some context around women.
Right.
So,
because there is a perception, women are always in the narrative of, and it's funny that you say, because even sometimes when I find myself commenting on women leadership, and women themselves in leadership positions feel the need to feed into this narrative. So sometimes when even you describe yourself as a leader, they use the word caring and compassionate,
yes.
because you feel as though if you say I am strong and I'm hard and I'm this, you would be categorized as a bitch, because that's really the narrative that you're one of those troublemakers and you're one of those emotional women. So they tend to also feed into that narrative of being empathetic and using the words that are so cliched. But you wanted to make a distinction as well.
Yes, but I also want to say those qualities have been stereotyped as feminine qualities, but they're actually excellent human qualities, and they're some of the qualities that are best for leadership. So for me also, when women are saying, when Mia Motley goes, because we care, for me, I want to see her infusing what are stereotypically feminine values into the domain of good human leadership values, and for us to redefine those away from femininity into seeing them as ways that good leaders should be. Good leaders should be caring. Good leaders should be, relational. Good leaders should listen well for both women and men. And so I think we have to keep with the times. And over the last 30 or 40 years, we've seen this infusion of these qualities and characteristics into the domain of leadership in a way that treats them as not just feminine values alone. I wanted to say something for us to keep in mind, and this is the narrative of individual women leaders. So when Forbes writes and other magazines writes, they're carrying a very individualistic story.
Right.
But, in Iceland, if you look at what happened in Iceland after the 2008 crisis, they had a vast change of leadership. A woman prime minister came in. She was an openly declared lesbian, first in the country. They prosecuted bankers. They removed male leadership that was corrupt across all kinds of levels. They instituted 50% quotas. They did a massive structural transformation across the society, which helps explain how you can get a leader of Iceland today who is young, who is an environmentalist. And so I want to kind of challenge this idea that it takes the great individual woman leader, and instead say that what we've found, even in my own work in the Caribbean, which is published in a collection called Negotiating Gender Policy and Politics in the Caribbean, what we found is that individual women also do well when there is a context, there's a social structure, there are institutions around them that share those transformational values also. And so Iceland went through that transition across the tiers of decision making a decade ago. When we look at what's happening in New Zealand, for example, we see a woman who's coming out of a particular activist history in which she's getting, there is a moral, shared moral feeling on the ground about what are the right policies, what is the right leadership, so that she herself is able to be that kind of leader without a lot of patriarchal resistance, or even without resistance to her, on the basis of her race or her sexuality or her own individual politics. And so the idea of women being able to be excellent leaders is also premised on a society sharing those same values. The current Prime Minister of Iceland was raised by two moms, is the youngest one in the world. These are the kinds of that support for youth leadership, that support for alternate families, that support for environmentalists as our leaders, that comes out of the wider experience in society. And what we found in studying Trinidad and Guyana, for example, Guyana has the only quota system, electoral quota system in the Caribbean. It's 30%. Is that even in that system, women are 30% of the voting list for the, put on by the party, but they may not even end up to be 30% in the parliament. And that's because there's a very patriarchal leadership that decides which women get in, and then those women become beholden to that leadership and its politics. And so they have very little room for them to be transformational in the way they've been trained to be.
Should we have, Gabby, you sit in a leadership position. I mean, you've always been, and I think, looking at your family tree, I've realized, because your mother's very vocal as well, and, you spoke a lot about your relationship with your father as well recently on Facebook, but you can tell that fiery spirit in you. Do we need to have a sort of specialized training for females in our country to make them, you know, because you talk, there's a leadership institute, but do we really need to separate that to tell our girls and our women it's okay to be strong, it's okay to control your own narrative, and fostering that in them?
Well, the women's movement has been doing 20 years of training of women political leaders across local government, across the region with the Caribbean Institute for Women in Leadership. What we've also realized, though, is that, and this is where my book on the 5 countries in the Caribbean and women's leadership, this is some of the conclusions it comes to, is that even when you have individual women who can be transformational leaders, where there is resistance to their transformational lives, to their transformational politics, where there is resistance around them to equality. If I'm saying, listen, we can't have a recovery plan, the Secretary General of the United Nations is saying gender equality must be central to every recovery. It must not be set back by recovery plans. And when we say this to the Prime Minister or to the population, there isn't a sense that gender equality matters at every step. We're not just letting men fight the battle, and win the war. And so, where it is that what we need to tackle it or empower is not just individual women leaders, and that work is going on. It's been going on in the corporate sector in excellent ways and will continue to go on. What we need to do is challenge the paradigms that hold back progressive women leaders from being able to make the kinds of very quick changes that we've been able to see out of New Zealand, that we've been able to see out of Taiwan, that we've been able to see out of these countries. For me, the core example of this is the change to the marriage laws regarding child marriage. When Mrs. Kamala Persad-Bissessar was in power, she had the opportunity to end those laws and didn't. Yeah. And that was because the party and herself as leadership chose to be beholden to extremely patriarchal Hindu, Muslim, and Christian leadership, in an exchange for votes. Had that leadership been on the right side of history, that religious leadership, and said, no, we absolutely, recognizing that this is about marrying young girls, experiencing male predation by older men, that we understand the power dynamics here, we understand the health and educational and lifelong implications, and as male leaders, we will support this progressive legislation, then Mrs. Kamala Persad-Bissessar may have made a better decision, and in my mind would have been on the better side of history. And so what women leaders also experience is called the glass cliff, which is where they're there as these kind of lonely women at the top, when they make decisions, and their women's decisions are always more critiqued than men's decisions. They are always talked about in ways that are... the lens that we use to analyze it is a lot more intense, and it is true. We judge them a lot more harshly. And they're always second-guessed. And so when you're a woman leader at the top, you're liable to fall off the glass cliff very easily, because you can go from being beloved one day to just being disparaged on every front. Your hair, your clothes, the way you speak, your decisions, everything, and people can speak about you. I've heard people, use language, she's evil, she's this, she's that. And women can be talked about, bad-mouthed in these ways so easily, because that, we have so little respect for women outside of our mothers or our sisters, right? We have so little respect for women and women's leadership in our society, which is why women's issues, gender equality, violence against women in general carry such low status at the highest levels of leadership. And so the argument is, in the Caribbean, what we need to do is reduce masculinist resistance. We need to reduce the patriarchal, containment of the struggle for gender equality. And in that reduced circumstance, we can take the women who have been trained to be transformational leaders, who would like to be transformational leaders, who want to improve as transformational leaders, and make the path a little bit less difficult for them, allowing them to rise. And finally, we don't only want women to be transformational leaders. When women are setting the examples in the ways that they have, we want men to be able to see that women are examples for men, just like mothers and women teachers who are great human beings can be examples for boys. We want, we have this idea that women are not examples for men. Only role models for men can be other men. And that's incredibly sexist, and it is incredibly dehumanizing. And so if we think about how do these women from Denmark, Iceland, Barbados, Finland, Germany, and all these countries, how can they also be an example of transformational leadership not just to women, but to men. How can they set the human standard? For me, that's where the transformation actually happens as well.
Sure.
That said, I think that our government has done an excellent job actually. And, you know, I've been really impressed with the sobriety and the decision-making that we've seen from the highest levels to most of this crisis.
Gabby, I do want to thank you very much, and you continue.
Always a pleasure.
Always, and you continue to inspire people like me every single day, because you do. You inspire and influence, and you change behavior. So definitely keep charting the course, because so many of us are following you in this battle. Thank you so much. That's Dr. Gabrielle Hosein. Thank you. She is the head of the Gender Institute, talking a little bit about our leadership. But there's an article. This all stemmed from an article on Forbes magazine, as well as the Guardian newspaper out of the UK, talking about the fact that women leadership clearly seems to be out in front in the COVID pandemic. We take a short break. When we come back, we'll have more for you.